In the previous lesson, we looked at how we can add event listeners into our JavaScript. So there is actually other ways as well. So the onClick method is limited in a way that you can only add one event listener per element. So you're not able to add additional ones, and there is different needs for adding event listeners. So if you want a really simple event listener, you could always use these onClicks. But if you want to get more sophisticated in event listeners, then you can add them as event listeners as well. So I'm going to show you how to do that in this lesson. So we've got our list items here, so we can go ahead and keep that source code there, and we've got our output as ID. So I'm going to set that up as an object and get element by ID. So now I've selected both of those elements, and I'm going to hide this code here because we're not going to really need to use it. We're going to use some of that stuff so we don't have to retype it. So now let's add in event listener. So we've got an element here, so I'm going to start with the simple one first and select the element and do add event listener. And what this does is it registers an event listener to a single target, and you also have the option to remove event listeners and so on. So you could also remove event listeners. So remove event listeners. So we've also have the option to remove them. So we can add them and remove them. So that's one of the good options of adding event listeners in this type of format, because you can add and remove them. So the event, they're not going to be on clicks. They're just going to be indicated as clicks. And then from here, we would specify the function that we want to fire off. So in this case, let's copy out this function and maybe reuse the same function. So click, and we just have that change me value there, and passing that over. So we've got our output add event listener click and change me, so it's going to fire off this function. And we're going to see that there is a problem here as well. So let's just take a look at this and see what happens. So what do you think the issue is going to be here? Whenever I click on it, we still don't have that value of this. Just like in the last lesson, we're limited to how much information we can pass within the functions within this type of format. So we do have options to add them in as a function directly within here. So this way we don't have to specify that we're listing it, so we could just do function, or we could fire off another function and tie that function together. So we could do something like this. So function, and then have the function actually fire off the value of this, passing it in, and so I'm just going to beautify that just to make sure that I got this correct. So the same thing that we had to do here earlier, where we had to build out a function with the onClick, we've got to do the same thing here if we want to pass the argument and pass those values through. If you're not worried about passing through the values, then that's okay. You don't need to worry about. You can just list out that function name. But because I am passing through an argument of this, then I want to make sure that I've got all of my bases covered here and that I'm able to utilize it. So just in case you're curious what actually is sitting in this, we see that it's the window object. So we've got all of the window information that actually gets passed in as this, because it's the window that is the current object, unless we're actually passing it through on the click event. And the really nice thing about doing it in this way as well, we can change it to mouse over, and we can have that same functionality for the mouse over, same element there. So now whenever we're hovering over, we can see that that is firing off that same event. So just like what we did earlier, we need to loop through all the different events to be able to pick them up. So if we want to do the same thing where we've got a bunch of list items here and loop through them, we could do the same thing and utilize that same functionality. So this is the list items going through the link, and here we would just need to add in as event listener. So the format is slightly different. But the idea is the same thing, where we've got adding event listener and then we've got our function there. So let's copy this out. And as we loop through them, I probably should keep that part there. Get rid of output. So add event listener, and on mouse over, we're going to fire off the change me function. And let's refresh that. So we do have an error there within the code. So let's take a look at that, beautify it, and see what's happened here. So it looks like not closing off this event listener properly, so we just got to make sure that I've got that rounded bracket in there. So that was what was throwing it off. So now everything is working as before. So whenever we're hovering over, we're able to toggle those colors and so on. So this is kind of annoying, so I just removed that out. So this was the other option for event listeners, and same thing with the previous option, is that you've got so much capability of all this information on these different elements. And we can see here within the actual dev tools here that we've got our list items here, and we can see that we've got all of the different available event listeners that we can add. So we have mouse leave, mouse move, play, on click, and so on wheel, and just a whole bunch of information here that we can set any one of these event listeners onto any one of these elements and get that dynamic interactive effect. And we see that as well within the source code, that those backgrounds are updating as we're hovering over them.